Welcome back to the last session of the day. So we have the great housing debate, and I think it's going to be the greatest session of urbanity. We've been asked to spice it up. So let's do just that. We are going to be talking about innovative solutions to Australia's housing crisis, and we've got four fabulous experts from very different fields on the stage with me today. So I'm going to ask each of you just to introduce your name and where you're from.
Okay, hi everyone, great to be here. Illan Samuel, Samuel Property. We're a Melbourne-based private developer, 15 years, which feels like about 30 in development years, and we focus mostly on inner and middle ring developments, residential predominantly, and mixed use. And I'm probably approaching today more from a private or capitalist approach, so hopefully I don't offend others, but obviously keen to unpack with lots of discussion.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Mike Myers. I'm retired. 42 years in social affordable housing in the UK and in Australia. Recently managing director of the National Affordable Housing Consortium, where we, along with our private partners and private financiers, delivered 4,000 homes over the last 10 years.
Fabulous, thank you.
Hi, I'm Kaleta. I'm from the Property Industry Foundation. For 26 years, we've been the charity of choice for the property and construction industry. We address the urgent issue of youth homelessness, and we do that through building, renovation, and funding systemic change.
Hi, Cameron Murray's my name. I run Fresh Economic Thinking, Australia's newest one-man think tank. I'm also the author of The Great Housing Hijack, which is a new book on this very topic.
Fabulous. So I think you can see we've got a nice diverse panel. We've got someone in youth homelessness and an expert in social and affordable housing, so possibly seeing that real human side of our housing crisis. We've got an economist who has a book, yes, The Great Housing Hijack. So let's see where that's been hijacked. And we have a developer who I guess is rolling up your sleeves and getting some housing and homes built. So welcome to the panel. We're going to just touch on everyone's perspective first and some solutions. We'll go into a bit of panel mode, so have a bit of a conversation, and feel free to send your questions through Slido because as we said, it will be some Q&A as well. But just to set the scene, Australians' housing crisis. We might all have different views on how bad that crisis is, how confronting, whether it's a crisis, but I think there's been three key statistics over the last couple of weeks in the press that might just set the scene. So Tim Reardon, HIA's chief economist, said last year the numbers are 163,000-ish things we delivered as homes in 2023, and that's about two-thirds of meeting the Australian government's target of 1.2 million homes across the next 5 years. So we're already only at two-thirds of what we should have produced in 1 year. So do we have the capacity? The CEO of Homelessness Australia says last year 57,519 people asked for help with accommodation and were not able to be given help. We have a human tragedy unfolding before us. And I think this one's interesting. We used to talk about quality of life indexes. Now it's pain indexes. So which suburbs have the most rental pain? And for 1/3 of Australians who rent at the moment, 72% of suburbs apparently have people experiencing extreme rental pain. So they're just a few stats that get thrown out there, and we're here to talk about, hopefully, some innovative solutions, what we might be able to do to respond to that. So I'll start with you, Illan.
Sure. Well, I think it's sort of important to acknowledge how do we get here? What's the state of play? So I think we've got, as you mentioned, really low approvals and they're dropping. We've got targets that are completely unsustainable in every city. And we really have, substantially, like a perfect storm, right? We've got all these elevated costs that on every sector, on every facet, are really hurting the market to activate and provide the supply. I think the private sector, we contribute about 97%, and then the government at 3%. So when we've got a constipated planning system where things can't get out, or what's getting out isn't meeting the market, so we're creating maybe dwellings that people actually don't want or they can't afford. We've heard it through the conference that in Victoria in particular, the BADs have really pushed sizes and that's pushed prices. And obviously that's, taking into account, again, construction costs, interest rates. So we can get approvals, right? But if they're not feasible, they're not going to get built. And we can debate what affordable housing means and what the definition is. To me, as a private developer, affordable housing is when I produce something that meets the market. My buyer considers it affordable and they are happy to pay the price that I'm asking for it in that location for that type of product. So I think we need to kind of start thinking about any supply is good supply. Like, let's not just wait for some sort of magic bullet that's going to come and all of a sudden there's going to be, I can talk about some ideas later about what my solutions might be, but really it's like another brick in the wall. Let's just get going. So I think a free and open market and getting things happening is really going to be important, because unless the private sector is motivated, like I said at the beginning, like unless I can make $1 out of this, I'm not going to do it just because the government says we need houses. I agree we need houses, but it needs to be feasible, and it's not a passion project to me. I need to be able to go to the bank and get money, and I need to make it economic and viable. So I think we all just need to be a bit more realistic that, like, it's a housing crisis. Let's not waste a crisis, but let's also not just assume that it's going to fix itself by hoping and wishing.
Thank you. Planning's constipated. I've not heard that one before, so well done. Let's throw that one out there. But I think that roll their sleeves up and let's just get some housing built is a good one. So it's about supply. Get some building. Build more.
Developers, we like to develop, right? And at the moment, it's a constant moving feast. So whether it's a new tax or it's a new regulation, we can't really have rules on the run, right? We need to have some certainty to be able to move forwards. Projects take a long time. And again, without that, it makes it very hard.
Fabulous. All right, so moving on to the social and affordable housing expert. Mike, what do you think?
Well, it certainly won't fix itself, and I think we all know that in this room. But also, we need to take a broader look at this, because this housing crisis has been decades in the making. It hasn't just arrived. Some fundamental things have gone wrong with the way that we organise our housing system and our planning system and our land use system. And while everybody, and I mean everybody, is talking supply, and the government itself has put a laser beam on 1.2 million homes, supply on its own won't fix the affordability crisis. We need to understand that the components that are making up this failure are multifaceted. We've got a housing tax system that is ripe for reform so that it drives that supply and it drives affordability. Our approach to land use and planning, despite the efforts that governments are saying about fast tracking, is still not clear and easy to use. We have an incredibly, by world standards, concentrated mortgage and finance arrangement in this country, which mitigates against both risk and against competition. And we're playing a forever game of catch up on infrastructure. So housing forward planning is held back by infrastructure failure. And most importantly of all in this, because it is a political issue about how we organize our system, we have political parties that are afraid of tackling the change, and they're afraid for two reasons. Changing the housing system will change the type and number of winners and losers, and that is a political and electoral problem for all parties. And secondly, the cost of changing and the complexity of changing makes politicians afraid. So they push it to one side, throw a housing future fund at it, say that they're going to fast track planning, and we will be here with our children and our children's children paying the price of this systematic failure. There are things that we can do right now that don't come at such a high political cost, and maybe we'll get around to those in the next part of the session.
That we will, absolutely. So I think perhaps we'll move straight on to Penny, and let's get your perspectives first as well. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I guess my perspective, because of the work that we do, my perspective comes from the youth homelessness lens. Some of So you've already heard that there are 46,000 young people who are homeless tonight in Australia, and 1 in 2 of them will be turned away from a service due to capacity. So definitely supply-led. You know, we're not living up to the challenge of looking after the next generation of Australians. You know, I think it's also shocking to think that 40% of all homelessness are youth, and that's under the age of 24. And when we generally, you know, talk about housing crisis and affordable housing, we're talking about, you know, our interest rates going up and, you know, our rent paying, and not actually putting it on that sort of lens about how to get the youth into housing and things like that. We are partnering with the peak youth homeless body, Y Foundations, to get a separate child and youth housing plan into the National Housing Plan, because right now a young person who is homeless will be treated exactly the same way as a 40-year-old, 50-year-old who is homeless, which, you know, is really incredible that we don't already have that. So the 17 to 24 age bracket are the age bracket that are relapsing back into homelessness, and that is because when you look through the way that children and youth work through the process, they go into transitional housing, is meant to be the final piece to their journey into independent living. But at the age of 18, I don't know how many of you have got 17, 18-year-olds, but they're expected then to compete with people like you and I in a rental market, or have come from crisis and transitional and do not have the, you know, the loans to be able to afford home loans. So we're finding that real bottleneck in that space, and that's why that's the biggest group for relapsing into homelessness. So for me, some of the solutions, or for us, some of the solutions in this space are tenancy reform. And looking at the ways that we can support young people in accommodation for longer. Mandatory inclusion, which I know we had a conversation about earlier, and what that looks like from a developer perspective, and also repurposing. There is over 1 million vacant properties in Australia today, that if we, as an industry, looked at how we repurpose those properties, we can potentially have a solution there.
Thank you. So from Mike and Penny, I think it's deeper than supply. It's systemic. There's inequalities in our system, and we've got to look more broadly for some solutions, which we will get to.
Yep.
I'll hand over to Cameron.
Thanks, Natalie. I think I might want to zoom out a little bit and spend a little bit more time defining the problem of housing right now. And I might start with a quote from a famous visitor to Sydney. And in their first day, and they wrote in their diary, "The number of large homes recently built is truly surprising. Nevertheless, everyone complains of the high rents and difficulty in procuring a house." That wasn't Taylor Swift on her Eras tours. That was Charles Darwin in 1836, in January. Before he noticed any of the Australian wildlife, he wrote in his diary, "The people complain about housing in Sydney." Right? The population of Sydney was 20,000. If we look around the world, there are panels, I'm sure, and conferences in Canada, New Zealand, the US, the UK today, having the same conversation. So we need to think about, why is it that we've got this sudden and global housing issue, right? Where did all the homes go all of a sudden? How did this happen? The headlines in 2018, 2019 were glut of houses in Sydney, double whammy for investors, rents and prices falling. But we've forgotten that today. So if we look at long term, I think we need to acknowledge that markets are doing today what they always do. Markets are great, right? They make trade-offs. They make sure we deliver the type of housing at the right location, the right size, the right quality, but also the right time. Markets don't build tomorrow's housing today. They don't keep pushing down and making their own next project infeasible. Every time there's a property cycle, we end up with the same situation. Oh, where did the houses go? We all want houses all of a sudden. That was true in 1911, when New South Wales had its first inquiry into rising rents in Sydney, that led to the first rental laws in New South Wales in 1915. And it's true every cycle. In fact, in the 1800s, the most popular political scientists in the world were those writing about the housing cycle and how workers in the industrial cities of Europe were left behind every time there's a huge economic boom period. So I think that's what we're having now, an economic expansion. And the crisis that comes out of it is this. Those who aren't homeowners, the non-homeowners, the private renters, they have to compete with each other for the best locations with their incomes. And if incomes are rising quickly but unevenly, someone's getting left behind. And it's those households who need the support of these non-market interventions. I don't think we're in the business of solving homelessness by making everybody's house worth less. Right? 66% of Australians are homeowners, 18% of Australian households are landlords. We don't want to make the $10 trillion of Australian housing worth $7 trillion. Okay, what we need to do is think outside the market and how to support people during these periods of rapid change when rents rise quickly, but not evenly. And some households get left behind, having to bid 50% more for their rent just to stay where they are, because their income's not rising, but everyone else's is. And I think there's a couple of solutions. One is more non-market options, right? One of my favorite examples is Singapore, where 88% of households are housed in Housing Development Board buildings that the Singaporean government has built through their state housing developer. They took home ownership from 20% in 1965, when Singapore became independent, to nearly 90% 2 decades later through this program. And I think for Australia, because we already have 67% home ownership, we only need to build up a small amount of this to capture all those people left behind, because it's just a small fraction of the 30% of renters. I think we can do that. Another useful thing is to smooth out these adjustment periods. Right? If the speed of adjustment is the problem, then we can slow it down with rules that limit how quickly rents rise. And I know it's a taboo topic, but if you go to continental Europe, this is completely mundane, boring stuff of having limits on how quickly rents can rise. And I think that adds to the security and minimises the disruption from those transition periods. Thanks, Natalie.
Thank you. So some different views there, some market, non-market. Let's look at things outside also of the planning system and look at financials. So there's a whole lot of ideas out there and innovative solutions perhaps. So let's focus now on some solutions, and then we might move on to what some of those barriers are and how we can pull them down. So perhaps going from non-market back to market, Illan, what do you think would be a great solution here?
Well, I think it's, what's the saying? Let's not waste a crisis. I think we need to start pulling all the levers, right? And it really comes in my mind to create a free and open market. So whether that's taxation reform, whether that's land taxes, I think the same property in Victoria versus ACT, same price, about a $47,000 difference in stamp duty. So we need to incentivise people to act, and that often can come from just reducing the gross cost for them to transact in the market, because every dollar that's spent in property, it moves through the market, you know. My buyer buys blinds from Lovelight. They use Maddocks for their conveyancing. The money flows through the market. And so if we're not incentivising people to transact, then the money doesn't flow. And so in my mind, it really starts with taxation reform. Planning reform would be great, but I can't see local, federal and state ever being on the same page and trying to get things moving. I like Cameron's point, but I'm a private developer, so like they can be our competition, and that's great, let's go at it. But from my perspective, let's just open things up, and again, like I said off the top, let's not think that things are okay, because it takes a long time. Like if I'm doing 100 apartments, it might take me 4 or 5 years from start to finish. So whilst we don't know it's a problem until it's a problem, like we actually do know it's a problem, right? Like we're trying to target 80,000 homes a year in Victoria, and I think we're on pace for about 50. So if you then kind of extrapolate that out to the next years, you then need to do 90 and 100,000, and you can't play that sort of catch up. We've never hit those targets ever before. So when you've got issues on construction and lending, and you've got buyers who can't, like they want to buy, but they can't get money from a bank because they're getting assessed at, 6% plus 3% buffer, that's the issue, right? Our vacancy rates in Victoria are sort of sub 1%. So, 1 out of 100 properties, and you then actually have to want that 1 out of 100, and you have to compete against, 150,000 people coming into the state every year through immigration. So, I really think we need to just really pull all the levers, not waste the crisis, and let everyone get to work.
Don't waste a good crisis. I agree. And I think that point you made earlier about 97% of housing is delivered by the private sector. I think, even if we can double or triple the amount of non-market housing, that's potentially still a drop in the ocean of what delivery we need to do to meet these targets. I'll go over to Mike. What's your solution?
I've got 4 things that could be done now, 2 in the planning area and 2 in the institutional investment area. But just to quantify the supply side shortage in the affordable housing space alone, according to the Australian Housing and Urban Research Institute, we need 750,000 more homes just to meet the unmet need in the affordable and social space. Now, some people see that as a social burden. I see it as an investment opportunity. Most of the houses, whether they're social or affordable, are built by the private sector. They're designed by architects and they're built by the private sector. So here's 4 quick things that I think are eminently doable. The first is we should have a mandatory social infrastructure workforce housing plan with every piece of social infrastructure we build. Every time we build a hospital, we should think about the workforce. Every time we build a school, we should be thinking about the workforce. And as part of the planning for that level of social infrastructure, we should require people to prepare a map of housing supply and need and matching to the income profile of those workers. So those workers can live and work near those places. Now, it doesn't mean to say that the people building the hospital have to build the schools. They will need to work in Queensland with Economic Development Queensland and other agencies to do it. But until we start planning that, we'll be having this question mark about how we meet essential worker housing needs forever and ever, and they'll be moving further and further away. The second is we do need to resolve the impasse of build to rent. If Australia had an institutional rental market equivalent to the average of the OECD, we would have 400,000 institutionally owned long-term rental properties, a proportion of which would be affordable. We have to get over that impasse. I would prefer to see an as-of-right increase in density for build-to-rent, with a proportion of them earmarked for affordable housing in exchange for that privilege and that right. And we need to do density better and bigger, and we need to use build-to-rent as a tool to make sure that the distribution of that is fairly across incomes. The last 2 are fairly straightforward. We did have a very successful investment scheme called the National Rental Affordability Scheme. For one of the things I did was help design that scheme, and my company delivered 10% of that. That brought $11 billion of private investment into affordable housing. Now, yes, we got the term wrong. It shouldn't have been 10 years. It should have been 25. Yes, we got the subsidy wrong. It shouldn't have been a flat rate. It should have been varied compared to different housing markets. But that was a tax-efficient system that could, over time, replace things like negative gearing and other forms of ineffective taxation, because it would be on the supply side that would generate the new supply and affordable rent. I think we could do easily, as originally was planned, 100,000 of those homes under that revised National Rental Affordability Scheme. Who built those houses? Who developed them? Lend-Lease were involved, A.V. Jennings were involved, Mirvat was involved, family building companies were involved, architects were involved. It was the industry. And the final thing is, if you take what governments are saying they want to see built in social and affordable housing in the next 5 years, it comes to $38 billion worth of new housing. And the money is just not corralled together to get that in. And one of the reasons is, if you're an institutional investor, what is your security if a social and affordable housing project goes wrong? You're not going to evict those vulnerable people. Your reputation as Hester Superfund or whoever would go down the pan. So we need to change the regulatory system that we've already got. It's already there, but we need to change it so that government will step in and make good those projects that government is funding in social affordable housing, and that will attract a lot more institutional investment over a lot longer period, which can actually increase the volume of supply in the social and affordable housing sector. Those tools are already there. We've already put them in front of planning ministers and housing ministers. They need to be considered. Institutions have got stacks of money waiting to go into this sector, but the risk profile is currently wrong. We need to fix that problem.
Love it, thank you. Full of ideas there. I think you've touched on some really big topics there, key worker housing, build to rent, and I think, you know, those systemic changes, but also learning from the past and doing things bigger and better. I'll hand over to you, Penny. What are your ideas?
Yeah, I guess building a little bit on what Mike's been saying, the challenge, again, looking from a youth perspective, is that in social and affordable housing, the youth normally gets overlooked. And the reason for that is the business model of social housing. The government, councils, everyone makes money from people being in affordable housing, and the youth don't have that, I guess, support and financial capability. So, and again, and what Cameron was talking about earlier, in has Australia was leading the way in tenancy, and we've actually, the rest of the world now leads the way, places like Europe, where you have the rent to own schemes. So families can rent and work towards owning their own property that they can then pass on to their children and their family, so that that homelessness doesn't continue. And Australia is really far behind in that space, whereas Europe has really overtaken that, and certainly places like Germany, Finland, and the UK. So, you know, really providing those schemes, I think, for me, around the homelessness, or for us, it's around homelessness, it's around creating stability, so that that young people can stay stable, so that they can then work on the support that they need to go on and thrive. So really, for me, the number one solutions, if I was to talk about today, is really around that tenancy and stabilising that market, so that people have a safe environment to thrive, to go on and thrive. And collaboration, I mean, you know, I'm very new to the property industry, but you know, every conversation I tend to have, it's federal government's fault, it's state government's fault, it's council's fault. You know, having a collaboration between, you know, the government agencies, the council agencies, private and public developers, I think would be a really key, you know, decision to get moving on the market.
Thank you. I think that stability point, as we have an increasing rental population, providing some stability going forward is key. And looking at the international ideas, we're not the only city or country or state having a crisis, and we don't have to try to find and invent the solutions ourselves. So let's look around the world. Cameron.
I might just pick up on a couple of points from Illan and Mike. Maybe add some spice, fun to. In terms of the quantity issue of getting more houses built, I think we have to keep in mind, we've been trying to not get housing built for 2 years in Australia and globally. We pushed up interest rates from 0% to 4.5%, the cash rate, because we wanted people to stop building houses because it was overheating the economy. So now we're here going, oh, we're not getting enough housing built. Yes, it works. So I think we need to sort of keep that in mind and remember that this cycle, like every cycle before us from 1836 to 1890s, was the biggest land cycle in Australia was the 1880s in Victoria, till 1911, it will correct itself, and we will have another construction boom in the next decade. You know, the high prices are the solution to high prices. On the build to rent, Mike, I'm just not sure what we're trying to achieve with build to rent. You can go to the Smith Collective here, a build to rent project, and rents are up 50% in 2 years. Exactly how is that different to, you know, mum and dad investor owning each individual property? And if I understand correctly, you know, the landlord there is the Abu Dhabi Investment Council. So why is it a good investment for a foreign government and not the Queensland government? I do find that a peculiar element. We want all this housing. Our governments say, no, housing's a huge cost, we don't like it. Foreign governments go, houses in Australia, best investment ever, let's do that. So we have this sort of strange situation happening. But I do like your point about worker housing, Mike. We have the Defence Housing Authority. If you work in the military, we have an authority whose job it is to make sure you get housed at a reasonable price. And I think that, that is a good exemplar of something you could scale up and broaden into various professions where you need to be in expensive locations, but you're not going to get paid, an expensive rate to live there. So that's one way to sort of leverage in, I think, and I'm with you on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I am getting so many questions from the audience, so I think we're going to jump to some of these questions, and particularly those that are being pushed up by other people liking them. So the first question, and I'll just throw it open to whoever wants to jump in and have a discussion about it, but with $3.5 billion allocated for infrastructure to deliver the Brisbane Olympics, can we use the platform of the Olympics to solve the issue?
I don't think that happened in Sydney, did it?
Well, I think we heard it just previously with Jack Hutchinson speaking that, to try to make sure that the village for the athletes is then usable in the future. I think, I'm not from Brisbane, but it would be an absolute waste if they don't find a way to actually provide supply, because I like it, Cameron, add a bit of spice, a bit of rebut there before, but realistically, I do think supply is the answer always, because any activity gets somebody out of one property into another and frees it up for somebody else to work it out, whether it's upgrading, downsizing, and I think there's other socioeconomic issues which I don't want to talk out of school. Obviously, I'm from the private sector side of things, but when people can't put a home over their, roof over their head, that creates other social issues. So I don't think we want to have a have and have not society. So constantly having that supply as population grows, it's the only way.
I would certainly support what Jack said this morning, and we're still hoping that the legacy part of the Olympics, this Olympics has been proclaimed for all the people of Queensland. That's what the Premier said, that's what all the people are involved in it. And yet the legacy part of it is really just a sketch on the back of an envelope. There is no hard legacy that is going to be for the benefit of all the people. And one of the biggest things that we can do for legacy is to ensure that investment that is on public land, at Fortitude Valley and elsewhere, where public infrastructure money is going to go into it, that becomes effectively something that meets the ordinary and everyday needs of Queenslanders. And more than that, there are a load of politicians around nowadays that are looking back to 5 years ago, saying, when we announced Cross River Rail, why didn't we think about the workforce? Why didn't we think about who's going to benefit by living near public transport? And those people who are going to benefit most by living near public transport are lower income people. I'm not talking about social divide, I'm talking about social inclusion, where the cleaner and the hospital porter and the person looking after our children in childcare can actually live in the same suburbs. And that's the Australia I volunteered to become a citizen of. And that's the Australia that most of you would recognise, but that's the Australia that's fast going.
Hopefully we can leave a fabulous legacy, but let's move on. This one perhaps we'll get a few different views on, and I like the controversy or the different perspectives, so keep going, we promise something spicy. So does it make more long-term sense for the government to incentivise private developers to build affordable housing, or help make the CHP sector self-sustainable?
I don't see that as a competition at all. My company was a registered Tier 1 community housing provider, and everything we did was with the private sector. Everything we designed, everything we built, the 3,000 homes we delivered in Queensland in a 5-year period, 3,000 affordable homes, was all done with the private sector. The big tower blocks we're building in Melbourne are all with the private sector. I don't think we should be putting government, community and industry and private finance in silos. That's what got us into this dichotomy where the social system is not part of the housing system. What a crazy way to think about things. We don't people who live in low-cost housing are not different than us. They just need housing that their income can service. And those are those basic workers that I've been talking about.
Sorry, did anyone else want to jump in on that one?
Well, I was just going to add to
Yeah,
that.
I mean, I was just going to say, I absolutely agree. The whole point of you need collaboration. The community housing providers can't deliver the scale that they want to alone, so they have to collaborate.
A question specifically for you, Illan. What's your thoughts on Japan's housing delivery model, as in developers build the shell and purchasers do their own fit-outs? Could that work here?
Yeah, I've seen that over in Malaysia as well, certainly at the lower end of the market. It comes with its own challenges. For us, we've got, building surveyors and quite a lot of regulation essentially. So I don't see how that would actually get an occupancy certificate. But I'm not a building surveyor, but certainly, we've got a market that's sort of got, a beer budget and champagne taste. People don't necessarily want to go in and do that work, but certainly that might have to be something that needs to be considered. A lot of the costs, though, in any new building, whether it's a tower, is in structure, it's in taxes. It's not so much in the fit-out. We can fuss over what appliance we put in and what colour tiles, but ultimately a lot of the costs are very much set. So, if it gets things moving, that would be great, but I'm not sure it'd actually be compliant.
One question for Cameron, and then we might start to wrap up. Singapore's HDB is a great and proven initiative. However, our government and IR systems differ vastly from Singapore. How can we bridge the gap?
I think we're talking about here having foreign workers doing construction, and a lot of countries have that. I think the trick here is that we're actually really good at building houses. Australia's probably built more houses per capita in the last 2 decades than almost any country I can think of off the top of my head. So the idea that we're not building a lot or that we're incapable of doing it, I think is wrong. It's just really having an economic structure, a way for people to access housing that is not by price, right? Most people, that's good. The private market works for most households, but we need some kind of alternative. And I think that you don't need cheap foreign workers to do a public home ownership scheme like Singapore. We didn't need cheap foreign workers to do defence housing. We didn't need them after the Second World War for all the community housing, Commonwealth state housing agreements that funded a lot of people into home ownership. So I don't think that's a key lever. I think the key lever is the design of having coordinated large-scale development and access at a regulated price rather than a market price.
There are so many questions here, so we could keep going, but I'm looking at that clock ticking down, and I wanted to give everyone one last minute to wrap up or give us your most important points. So we'll start from this end this time. Cameron?
I don't have much to say. Markets are doing what they always do, but during those periods where there's rapid change, like we had globally post-COVID, like we had all the cycles through the 1800s and the early 1900s, some people get left behind. And so if we can define the problem as that and have that safety net or smooth off those changes, I think we'll be a long way ahead.
Thank you. Penny?
Human-led and collaboration for me would be the absolute key.
Mike?
A housing system that tries to house all of Australians, and a housing system that's supported by financial planning, land use, and social inclusion agendas that brings people together, and the private sector will be the ones who deliver that or not deliver that, but the government system is the ones that enable it.
Well, I think what I sort of heard a lot of passion from everybody from different viewpoints, and I think that's sort of what echoes what I mentioned earlier. Let's just all work together and get started, and that comes back down to sort of a free and open market. So less regulation and letting the private sector and even the government sector get moving and try to meet the targets.
And this whole room can get moving because at the end of the day, that's all what we're here for. So thank you very much. Very enlightened panel. Loved listening to all of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Penny.